Mr. Boaz, how you doing?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. What's your elevator pitch for libertarianism? If someone doesn't know what it is, how do you start that conversation with what is libertarianism?
Libertarianism is the idea that adult individuals have the right and the responsibility to make the important decisions about their own lives. And I think you say that to most people and they would say, well, sure, who disagrees with that? Well, the answer is lots of Democrats and lots of Republicans disagree with that. And when I say important decisions about your own life, I mean, for instance, you should be able to decide what you eat and drink and smoke and read and what podcasts you're allowed to listen to. And you should be able to decide who you're going to marry and where you're going to send your kids to school and how you're going to spend the money you earn. And all of those rights and responsibilities are taken away by either the U.S. government or state governments or various other governments.
Okay. And tell me a little bit about your journey to to libertarianism, how you came to it, because I would imagine a lot of families are either liberal, Democrats or Republicans, conservatives or modern liberals. And so how did you come to libertarianism and what influenced you?
Well, I grew up in the South in Kentucky at a time when most people around there were Democrats and conservatives. We don't have many conservative Democrats anymore. We don't have many liberal Republicans anymore. But back in those days, the parties were not as ideological. So most of the people in the South were conservative Democrats. And my parents were well educated and we had books around the house, and I got more interested in ideas about politics and the relationship of the individual and the state than most people do growing up. And so I started reading I started reading things. I read Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson. I read Barry Goldwater's book, Conscience of a Conservative, which is mostly a very libertarian book. He had a very restricted view of what the federal government ought to do. Then I read Ayn Rand and I read Rothbard and Hayek and so on. And so over the first few years of my political consciousness, I kind of went from being a Democrat to a conservative to a libertarian. And somewhere after deciding, yes, I am definitely a libertarian, I believe in individual rights, and I think the government should respect individual rights. I was out looking for jobs, and I had a couple of jobs, and then I found the Cato Institute.
And then you kind of started from the bottom, and now you're here, at the Cato Institute. Started from there. What was your position at the Cato Institute?
Well, when I started at Cato, we were pretty small, so I wasn't exactly at the bottom. It's just that it was a small organization, and as it got bigger, I took on more management, and there were more people to manage and more projects going on. So, yeah.
No, cool, nice, yeah. And one that I read, since we booked this interview, I was able to bang through half of the of your book, Libertarian Mind. I think you originally wrote it in 1997, right? It was called a primer or something at the time, and then
that's right. I wrote it as Libertarianism, a primer, and then in 2015 published the updated edition called The Libertarian Mind.
Right, because I remember there was a lot of references to the Obama administration at that time too. So that was a pretty good update. So one thing I thought was pretty cool in chapter 2, you were talking his historical context, and a lot of freedom, this idea of it comes down from kind of two things. One, you mentioned how it's even kind of listed in Christianity, this idea of freedom, so it's a very old school concept. Would you agree with that? Or it came out of it's in the religious idea, freedom is an inherent for human rights. So.
Yes, but I think you can go back before Christianity. I think you can find it in both the Greek and the Jewish traditions. The first couple of I did a separate book called The Libertarian Reader, and that's a collection of great libertarian writings over the centuries, over the millennia, in fact. And then I talk about those in chapter 2 of the Libertarian Mind. And the earliest readings that I think reflect libertarian ideas are Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, that are it's Eastern philosophy, but it talks about governing a great kingdom lightly. And the more laws and regulations are, the more unhappy the people are. Meanwhile, over in the Western world, although originally there in the Middle East with the Greeks and the ancient Israelites, in 1 Samuel 8, the Jews ask God to give them a king. And God warns them, this will be the way of the king that will rule over you. He will take your young men to run beside his chariots. He will take your young women to work in his kitchens. He will take the 10th part of your vine and your oil, and you will cry out in that day because you have a king. So that's like a very early warning that power is dangerous and you should not want to be ruled by a king. And meanwhile, there's a natural law tradition coming from the Greeks that you can see in Antigone. Antigone wants to bury her father, but she's not allowed to. And she says, there is a law written in the stars before the world was made about the way human beings should act. So this natural law idea and this skepticism about power, I think those are very fundamental to the development of the libertarian idea. And also, I should say the liberal idea, because for a couple of centuries, the ideas I'm talking about were just called liberalism. It was liberals who wanted to get rid of monarchies, get rid of mercantilism, get rid of hierarchies like nobility and aristocracy, and have a world of liberty and equality. And then in the 19th century, in the 20th century, there were some changes in the way people understood the word liberal. So we started using the term libertarian.
Oh, cool. Yeah. And do you like that word libertarian? I think saw something where you were like, it's the common phrase, but I'm not excited about it. I like being called a classical liberal.
Well, I think libertarianism is, I think I may have said, an ugly neologism. It's long. It's a sort of invented word. Liberal is really the word that I would rather use. And I don't want to say classical liberal, really, because classical implies it happened a long time ago, like classical music or classical Greece. So I just want to say liberal, but that doesn't always convey to people what I want it to. So that's why I wrote a book called The Libertarian Mind, because that's the word we use these days for the ideas of individual rights, free markets, and limited government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that started probably roughly in the 70s, right? I think so, 1970s.
Well, you might say the modern movement started in the 70s. The term was used somewhat before that. But yes, I think, and one of the things that happened was the era of Vietnam, Watergate, and stagflation. Here you had this terrible war that was not successful. You had revelations of corruption at the highest level of the U.S. government, and the government claimed to be able to manage the economy, and it gave us what came to be known as stagflation. An economy that wasn't growing, was stagnant, but still had high inflation, prices getting higher all the time. There'd been this attitude that inflation and unemployment were a trade-off, that if inflation was higher, employment would be strong, and if you controlled inflation, you would get unemployment. But in the 1970s, the federal government managed to produce high inflation along with high unemployment. Mm-hmm. And so logically, that pushed a lot of people to saying this government that makes war badly and is corrupt and can't manage the economy maybe isn't the right way to run the world. Mm-hmm. And let's look for an alternative to this all-encompassing government. And so they were pushed, I think, in a libertarian direction. Now, that doesn't mean everybody got all the way to I'm a libertarian, but I do think you see a movement emerging at that point with older people like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, who won a Nobel Prize in the 70s, and then a younger generation of people who were reading those older scholars and coming to believe in what they were writing about.
Yeah, because I mean, historically speaking, if you look at in the 60s, you had like Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, who were, and I'll put Ford in there too, or these larger than life figures, you know, and they just messed things up after a period of time. And so we got Jimmy Carter, who was kind of like seemed like a more of a low key guy. So there was this pushback from like, we don't want this like big government kind of a vibe. So I could see that.
Right.
Yeah. There was another thing too, and I've talked about this. There's the republic. There's the concept called the republic, and there's democracy. And democracy doesn't always equal freedom. That was in your book also. Can you speak to that? About how-
Well, yeah. I mean, no form of government is inherently going to protect freedom. So in America, we mostly say democracy, and we kind of mean freedom, or we mean a Republican form of government. The American founders thought democracy was a dangerous thing because they thought of it as being the mob. And the mob might go after its enemies, or the mob might want to take people's property. The mob might want to vote itself money out of the public treasury. And so what they would have said was, well, we want a republic, and a republic has a constitution, and it has a government that does certain things but isn't allowed to do everything. And it isn't ruled by direct democracy like a New England town meeting. It's ruled by representative democracy, and even sort of doubly representative, like let's elect the electors, the best men in every state. And of course, at that time, it would have been men. And then they choose the president, because how could those of us in the backwoods of Virginia know who's the best person in America to be president? But we'll elect the best people in the state, and they will know who would make the best president. And we've gotten away from that particular aspect of republic. But yes, there was this long tradition of saying a republic is a limited constitutional government, and in theory, a democracy could be a sort of unlimited, anything you vote for, you can have government. Today, though, I think most Americans, if you ask them what democracy means, they're going to say it means we elect our government, we govern ourselves, it means we have freedom. And if you press them on it, yes, it means we have independent judges who can't be pressured by the politicians. It means we have freedom of the press. It means we have freedom of religion. So probably shouldn't make too much of that distinction. I would say I favor limited constitutional Republican government. So I want the government limited by the Constitution. I want not direct democracy, but representative democracy, which is to say like republic. And I definitely want that government to be limited, because every expansion of government beyond its proper function is taking away somebody's freedom.
Yeah. And I was just thinking, like, I get that. And as just like being a person who grew up listening to reading about libertarianism and what a republic is, but try explaining that to somebody on like Fox News or CNN, democracy just sounds a lot better, because you almost have to get rid of this concept of like fairness, if you know what I mean. It's like, just because of what I feel like there's this idea of like, oh, cool, every one citizen gets one vote and they get their voice heard. But it's not always in the best right of the people. So when you bring that up, that concept of the mob, it's a republic. It's trying to like protect it from yourself, if you know what I mean.
Well, right. Every person gets one vote, but we don't get to vote on everything. We don't get to vote to take your property. We don't get to vote on whether you should be allowed to marry the person you love. I mean, we do, but we've tried to set those things apart in the Constitution, and then our court decisions. Obviously, we used to have the country originally had slavery. The country later had Jim Crow rules. Mm-hmm. And through a combination of moral awakening and political action, and also the independent courts striking down things that don't really comport with the Constitution, we have made a lot of progress in those areas. But it is an indication that what we really want is a government that's limited by the Constitution to protecting people's rights and not interfering with people's rights.
I think that's right. I agree with you. Is there anything you can say that, looking at like people like Karl Marx, since he's the cornerstone of communism, was there anything like in his type, the socialist, is there anything that they got right about society that libertarians can meet in the middle ground with them on, or is everything kind of nuts?
There are lots of people you might say are on the left that libertarians have something in common with. There was an anti-war movement in the Vietnam era. There was the counterculture that challenged a lot of the ways things were done, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, all demanding that America finally make good on its promise that all people are created equal and have certain unalienable rights. None of that is Marxism. So I don't think there is much to get from Karl Marx and Marxism, but there's a lot that we can get from the people on the left who have challenged the establishment, who challenged the monarchy, who challenged the great university bureaucracies, who challenged the social customs and laws that restricted a lot of social, political, and economic life to straight white men. In those areas, libertarians can consider themselves on the left. In areas about economics, we sort of think, well, that's on the right, except even there, people on the left have often been very good at criticizing economic arrangements that were called private property and free enterprise, but were in fact privileges for some people, giving out government-granted monopolies and contracts, tariffs, for instance, that protect American businesses from foreign competition. All those kinds of things, people on the American left and libertarians ought to be working together on, and sometimes we do.
Sometimes. I remember, so we were talking about the Students for Liberty conference. I remember I was there one year. I think this was 2013 with and I was there when the tapings of Stossel, and I think he had Dennis Kucinich on. And the only thing that they ever really agreed upon, and it's got a big roar, which is about that the president doesn't have the right to kill you, basically send a drone strike to kill you. And that's kind of where the libertarians just like all like erupted in like applause, like yeah. That was the only time, and I kind of liked the guy because of it. But I get it, and I think he was also in favor of abolishing the Federal Reserve. But
he may be, but I wouldn't want to put Dennis Kucinich in charge of the money supply. However, in areas like war and civil liberties, the FBI and the CIA, it was people on the left who exposed the COINTEL program that was the government doing a lot of spying on American political dissidents.
Right. Yeah. So this is back in 2016, 2015, 2016. I remember Rand Paul announced his candidacy for president, and I thought, oh, cool, we're gonna get he's a pretty libertarian faction of the right, you would say. So I thought, cool, there's gonna be more of a conversation about libertarianism. Granted, his father ran too twice, but he was more of he meld with the Republicans. Let's put it that way. I thought, cool. So there'll be a little bit more in the conversation. And then Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president. And I feel he took the libertarian spotlight away from the libertarians. Do you feel that was the case? And would he have more of a conversation about libertarianism if he had not run, or am I just projecting?
Well, I don't think he took any libertarian spotlight away. I mean, he was anti-immigrant and anti-free trade, and he was all about me. I alone can fix it. I mean, he was I'm a man on a white horse, and I will fix everything because everybody else is stupid and I'm smart. The one area where I think he and Paul did overlap was they were the only two candidates who were opposed to the Iraq War. And what all the other candidates, I think, maybe didn't realize was that Americans by 2015 were tired of the Iraq War. And if Paul had been the only candidate on stage who was opposed to the Iraq War, then I think he would have had a cleaner path to pick up the vote of people for whom that was an important issue. Trump was just bigger and louder and more fascinating to watch. I mean, in a way, it's like, being fascinated by crashes at the Indy 500, but he was better TV than the other candidates. And so he just sucked up a lot of the air from all the candidates. Not just Fox, but CNN used to broadcast his speeches live. So I don't think it's a matter of cutting into the Libertarian vote. I think he cut into the Republican vote generally. And up until Trump got in the race, Republican strategists had all thought the Republican base is Reaganite, meaning they believe in free markets and lower taxes. They believe in social conservatism, which might mean being pro-life, maybe not being pro-gay, maybe being anti-drugs, and they believe in a strong national defense. And then Trump came along, and Trump's not really for free markets. He doesn't like free trade. He doesn't like open immigration. He's not really a social conservative. He's had a lot of wives and a lot of other women. He wasn't particularly anti-gay. And he didn't believe in the Reagan-Bush concept of strong national defense. And it turned out, I think, that the Republican base was not as Reaganite as people thought. And as I say, and I gave a speech at Ronald Reagan's ranch a couple of years ago in which I talked about having been a young Reaganite when I was a kid and being an admirer and a very young man.
Yeah. My age.
And being a supporter of Reagan's free markets, moderate social conservatism, and strong national defense, and how I came to rethink some of those issues and ended up not being a Reagan supporter, being a libertarian. But I would rather be debating Reaganite conservatives than Trump Republicans.
I could see that. Yeah. Trump. And actually, fun fact too, the way I got into libertarianism was actually like a montage on YouTube, a video of both Reagan's speech for Barry Goldwater and the splicing it with some speeches with Ron Paul. I was like, oh, cool. This is how we kind of get there. With the rise in popularity amongst young people, I live in New York, and there's a lot of liberals here. Some conservatives too, but a lot of liberals. With the rise of the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders of the world, do you sense any fear about them, their popularity?
Well, yeah. I mean, Bernie in particular calls himself a socialist, and I think he really is. I mean, he honeymooned in the Soviet Union. AOC, yeah, he did. AOC is a different generation, and I think not as fully old left ideological. I think AOC sees things that are wrong in the country, and she wants to fix them. And some of them are her perception that Black and brown people in particular are still not fully welcomed in economic, social, and political life. And she wants to fight that. And unfortunately, I think she ties that to capitalism. To me, capitalism, whatever you call it, the free market, the competitive open market, has been a great liberating force. If you go back to before the capitalist world, around 1700, then every place in the world, there are hierarchies. There's the caste system in India. There's the Chinese social system. In the Western world, there are kings and nobles and aristocrats and the priestly class, and then a whole bunch of people are serfs and peasants. So capitalism or liberalism, the market economy, is what liberated all of us to no longer have to bow our heads whenever our betters pass us. And I think AOC doesn't see that, and I wish she did. So I think she has a lot of bad ideas about economics, perhaps because she doesn't understand, in my view, what the real choice between giving a lot of people actual power with guns versus opening up the economy and letting everybody participate. That choice to me is clear. You want an open society, an open economy, and nobody has the right to use force except when other people have initiated force as criminals. So a lot of disagreements there. But again, I think on issues like being against war, being against state-sponsored discrimination, being for criminal justice reform, I think we can find common cause with the kind of young people who are attracted to AOC.
Yeah, on that note, to common ground, she did post Instagram reel about the big tech, about all these major technological companies, and I wanted to ask about, there are a lot of Americans that are concerned about that, particularly when it comes to big tech and the algorithms and them controlling what kind of media you get. So how do we approach that? How, as like libertarians, how would a libertarian federal government approach that without infringing on the rights of these companies, these private companies, in terms of?
Well, I think that's what we do. We don't infringe on the rights of the companies or anybody else. Mm-hmm. You know, I've always said I'm a First Amendment absolutist. I believe everybody has a right to free speech. Mm-hmm. And it used to be, if you said you were a First Amendment absolutist, people thought you were on the left. You're like the ACLU, you know, mm-hmm. The ACLU is out there defending the rights of communists, but also of Nazis, defending the rights of everybody to speak. These days, if you say you're a First Amendment absolutist, people may think you're on the right because you're saying, hey, even racists have a right to speak. Yep. When you talk about big tech companies, the interesting thing to me is, look, when I grew up, you got your news from 3 networks, and if you were lucky, 1 or 2 local newspapers. And we had free speech, although the networks were more regulated than the newspapers. Now you can get your news and information from 500 TV channels and every radio station in the world, because you can get them on the internet, not to mention podcasts and all your friends on social media and your enemies on social media. I mean, I followed Donald Trump on Twitter. I didn't like him, but I thought I needed to know what he was saying. And so to think that our free speech is being limited because there may be algorithms or what in Twitter and Facebook. 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have Twitter and Facebook. So whatever speech you're getting from Twitter and Facebook is an advance over what we used to have. As far as I'm concerned, they're private companies. And if Twitter wants to say no libertarians, well, I'd be pissed off. I'd complain about it. I would write newspaper articles and Facebook posts saying this is stupid and wrong, but it's their company and they have a right to do it. I don't have to invite Bernie Sanders to speak at the Cato Institute. The New York Times doesn't have to publish my articles. And Twitter doesn't have to let anybody on that it doesn't want to. Now, I think both Twitter and Facebook provide more opportunity for more speech than any other platform in history. We always had free speech, but you could go around your neighborhood expressing your opinion. You don't even know what a mimeograph is, but in my day, you could have gotten a mimeograph and printed some flyers that gave your opinion and you could hand them out. And maybe you could write for a newspaper. Not many people could, but you could send articles. You could write letters to the editor. But now anybody, unless they've been banned for some antisocial activity, can post what they want to on Facebook and Twitter, and maybe only your friends see it. But if you write something interesting enough and your friends start retweeting it, it could go viral, even though nobody's ever heard of you until today. So I think we have a wonderful world of free speech. Now, that doesn't mean we can't complain. If we think that conservatives get bounced from Facebook or Twitter more than other people, well, we can complain about that. And if we think colleges and universities are bouncing conservative professors and conservative students, then it's perfectly reasonable to criticize that. And by the way, if they're state universities, like the State University of New York, the University of Virginia, then we can tell them the First Amendment applies to your university. So you actually can't say we will only hire left liberal professors and we will not let the college Republicans bring in the speakers of their choice, because you are a government. But if you're a private university, I went to Vanderbilt, everybody's heard of Harvard and Yale. They seem to discriminate sometimes against conservative professors or conservative speakers. They're private universities. They're allowed to do that, and we're allowed to criticize. The nation's largest newspaper is the Wall Street Journal, and they run lots of articles criticizing cancel culture on campus. So it's not that the message about cancel culture doesn't get heard. It just might not get heard at Harvard or Yale. So I'm still a First Amendment absolutist. I think every person, every newspaper, every private company can make its own decisions. And I just point out that when people say, well, I think we should just apply the First Amendment to Facebook or Twitter as if they were government agencies. First, I just think that's wrong. They're not government agencies. Second, there is a whole lot of stuff that is legal speech that you do not want to see every time you open up Facebook. Racism, vulgarity, obscenity, violence, videos of dead bodies and murders and so on. Some of that's legal, but it would not enhance your Facebook experience to have that on there. So they have to make some criteria for what they will allow. Do they make mistakes? Oh, I think they do. I mean, I've seen friends of mine who post something that's anti-Nazi, but the algorithm sees the word Nazi and says, oh, we're taking this down.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I think there are a lot of problems like that, and I hope they're working on their algorithms and so on. But it's tough. They have billions and billions of things being posted on Facebook and Twitter, and you can't have a smart person looking at each one and saying, "Oh, that's not an evil thing. He's calling out evil."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bring up a good point, which is about the amount of people that are on there posting things. It's just so much. I mean, I don't know what the solution is. I'm not a tech guy. I mean, kind of, but you know what I mean. When it comes to privacy rights, too, a lot of these companies, we've done this for a while, using user data and as information, taking it. And how does that affect the individual's privacy rights there?
Well, again, I think that it is a matter of, it's in the private sector. It's a matter of individual choices. I remember reading a privacy expert like 10 years ago saying, people say they care a lot about privacy, but they'll give a DNA sample for a free Big Mac. So if you really care about privacy, there are ways to protect it. They involve some inconvenience, some costs. I think these companies like Apple and Facebook are getting better about giving you options to say, don't share my data. But they certainly have. The other thing, so I think it's a matter of individual rights and contracts. And if customers don't like it, if customers don't like what Google does, they can go to Bing or DuckDuckGo or various other search engines. Similarly, there are alternatives to Facebook and Twitter. Whether they're any better on this privacy issue, I don't know. The other thing that occurs to me is that when private companies use my data, what they mostly do is use it to target ads that they think I'll actually be interested in. So I don't get very many ads for baby needs, but a lot of women who talk about pregnancy on Facebook will get ads for diapers and babysitting services and all of that. And so it doesn't bother me that much that I get ads that are targeted to me. And we all joke on Facebook when we get ads that are clearly not targeted to us. Like, who thought I would be interested in that? When Whereas the data that government has about us, they can use it to get into our bank, get an order to look at our bank accounts, to come to our house, to arrest us, to prosecute us, even in extreme circumstances, to round up all the Japanese Americans and put them in internment camps. How were they able to do that? Because the Census Bureau knew where the Japanese Americans were, and they told whatever branch of government was going to round up the Japanese Americans. So I'd much rather have Facebook have my data than the federal government or any other government have it. The problem there is that the government can pressure Facebook to give up the data, or it can even get a court order that they have to give up the data on you or on, they could say, everyone who has liked a post supporting the Russian war in Ukraine, we want their names. And Facebook, if you know their addresses, we want their addresses. That's where the problem comes in. It's that the data might be acquired by government. And that, to me, is a good reason to take more precautions about privacy. But as I say, we're all willing to give up a lot of privacy for convenience. You don't need to leave all your cookies on your computer. But if you don't, every time you go to Facebook, you're going to have to sign in again and remember your password. And if you have a system that remembers your password, well, then that's some of your data somewhere. So I started out with social media, like registering for the New York Times or for Facebook, using fake names and so on. Mm-hmm. And then I realized, well, that's dumb. That means if I send a friend if I send a New York Times article to a friend, it's going to say it comes from Darth Vader. He's not going to know who it was who thought he'd be interested in this. So I stopped doing that.
Yeah. I remember when I started, Facebook came up, or at least was a big deal, or at least we were allowed to go on it when I was in ninth grade, high school. I remember the girl that told me I should go on it. Her name was Melissa Shawn, and she was like, "Tommy, you should go on it. It's really addicting." I don't know. I never heard. Imagine that, someone selling you on something and saying, "Hey, do this. It's addicting." But no, I remember like everybody on there was like giving like fake ages. I remember. I don't know if that's real. Yeah.
People do that lots of places. Ever seen a list of Hollywood actresses' ages?
No, I mean, I go on IMDb, but I mean, I just go from there.
And these days it's harder for people to hide their ages, but it used to be something that actors and actresses in particular would try to shave a few years off their age. It was said that Nancy Reagan always claimed to be 2 years younger than she really was. But sure. There are records that are available. And so if you go to IMDb, I'll bet they have, in fact, combed public records and Wikipedia and so on. And so the ages are probably pretty accurate. And that's part of the age of information. It used to be you could show up in an agent's office and say, "Hey, I'm here from Kentucky and I'm 18. And they go, "Okay, 18. But now they can find out how old you are. And the Social Security system knows how old you are and knows that you have to be paying or collecting or whatever. So there's less of that. But I can see how on Facebook, I find that a lot of people just don't put the year they were born on Facebook. They're not required to publish it.
Yeah, back in those days too, I remember I put up my address because it was asking for my address, and then someone in my family said take that down for good reason. But there was a lot of things because, again, this is going back in 2009, 2008. Obama had just gotten elected. And so there was a lot of things going on too. And I think at that time we weren't allowed, we had to be a certain age to be on there. At least at that time I thought so. And I was like, there's no way that person's 21. They're like, they're 14, they're 15. Anyway, good times. High school.
Oh, you knew people who were lying to make themselves look older. I forgot it. I'm so old, I forgot that part. But yes, of course, and people used to have fake IDs so they could buy alcohol.
Oh, yeah. No, we were, because remember, we were 13, 14 at the time, ninth grade. So I guess let's talk a little bit about like the world we're living in here. So there's in entertainment and in entertainment, in news outlets and other media outlets, there seems to be a political slant towards modern day liberals, Democrats, or progressive, let's call them that. Now, that seems to kind of like change the political discourse where you can't really get, sounds like you got to really dig for opinions that aren't, or entertainment or anything that isn't, has a slant towards a modern liberalism. Even the CDC, government agencies, a lot of them have been reported to be liberal or Democrats. And so when did that start? Is there like a way for us to track how that started, and how does that change, or what do we do about it over time?
Well, I would say that for my entire life, there's certainly been a perception that the people in the elite media lean left, lean liberal in the modern sense, and therefore prefer Democrats to Republicans. In 1968, or right after 1968, a woman named Edith Ephron wrote a book called The News Twisters, and she claimed that all three networks had, in her view, twisted the news to make Nixon look bad and make Humphrey and maybe LBJ look better. So that's 1968. So it's been that way for a long time. And I think a large measure of that is that for whatever reason, people who are more or less on the left are more inclined to go into professions like creative professions, journalism, maybe government as well. People who are more on the right are probably more likely to go into business. They see that, was it Calvin Coolidge who said the business of America is business? That's where conservative and Republican folks want to go. So it's a bias more in the sense of, if all the people around you kind of think one way, you're going to tend to think that way too. And so they're there. I've heard John Stossel talk about how at ABC, he was kind of the only person who thought the way he did. Everybody else just was sort of a reflexive liberal Democrat. And it wasn't that they would refuse to hire people like John Stossel, although he was kind of a reflexive liberal Democrat when he started out. He just said, over the years, I realized that government didn't solve the problems I was always exposing, and the market eventually solved more of them better than that. These days, though, remember, as I say, when I was growing up, 3 networks and maybe 1 local paper. Now, all these networks, all these newspapers and aggregators and blogs and podcasts and everything. So if you want conservative news, Fox is there 24 hours a day. Fox even has 2 channels of conservative news. And if you think Fox isn't conservative enough, there's new channels to the right of Fox. So it's true that you've got 3 big networks that are still the big networks, but by less of a margin than they used to be. But you can find the conservative news there, and there's a whole conservative news ecosystem, I guess. What there's not much of is a libertarian news ecosystem. You get Reason Magazine, that's a good place to get libertarian news and opinion. And obviously the website of the Cato Institute, the website of Students for Liberty. But those are not journalism in the same way. If you want to know what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Burma, what's going on in China, you kind of have to go to the big elite news sources, BBC, NPR, NBC, ABC, and those do tend to come at it from a more liberal point of view. Of course, there's some areas where I'm glad they have a liberal point of view. The elite media were pretty anti-gay back in the 60s and 70s, but as elite liberal opinion changed, so did the elite media. And I would say from the 80s on, the elite media, and again, I mean like NPR, PBS, the New York Times, were more pro-gay rights, eventually pro-gay marriage. And I agreed with them on that.
Hey, you mentioned Fox News has 2 channels. Now, going back to when I was in high school, and my stepdad still is pretty big Fox News guy. And I remember watching Fox Business, and they were kind of libertarian. I mean, they had Judge Angie Napolitano at the time. They had Stossel, and I think Kennedy had her show, or was getting her show Would you ever think that was more libertarian leaning, that channel?
It did seem for a while there that Fox Business was kind of a place they put libertarians. They were trying to create a business channel, and for a long time, they weren't really out competing CNBC. And of course, as you know, these cable news channels tend to run news from the morning to 6 o'clock, and then they kind of switch over to opinion shows. And so it was really the opinion shows in the evening where Fox was hard right and then hard Trump. And Fox Business was a little different. You're right. They had Napolitano. They had a show called The Independents with Kennedy, I think, and Matt Welch and Camille Foster. And then they ended up just making it Kennedy. And that was a pretty libertarian show. These days, I'm not sure how much difference there is between Fox and Fox Business, except that Fox Business for much of the day is focused on business news.
And just by that way, you're just a little bit more fiscally economic conservative slash libertarian-esque, because you're talking about free markets, or at least you're talking about money.
Well, yeah, you can. I mean, obviously, you can talk about business and economic issues from a pro-government intervention point of view. You can be protectionist, you can be in favor of government subsidies or high taxes. But yes, it was easier for a relatively conservative network to make its business network more pro-free enterprise, pro-business, pro-market, and that probably then allowed scope for libertarian views in other issues. And they seem to have moved somewhat away from that.
I guess because I don't have cable. I just see everything I get is just from whatever I can stream. But no, I back in those days. So cool. I was right about that. I thought I would be a little bit wrong. So I guess turning towards a little bit more topical stuff nowadays. Let's start out with did you watch the State of the Union last night?
I did.
Oh, so what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, I wish they would just write it down, put it in a letter, and mail it to Congress, and then I wouldn't have to watch. This particular speech started out, I thought, with a strong discussion of, standing for democracy in Ukraine and rallying really the whole world against the Russian invasion. So that was good. From then on, like a lot of Democratic State of the Unions in particular, it was just a laundry list of ways the president proposes to screw up the economy. I mean, he said, I know people are worried about inflation. I've got a plan. Not a single aspect of his plan would be good for the problem of inflation. I mean, he said, we want to make more things in the United States. You know why we buy stuff from overseas? Because it's cheaper. They can make it cheaper over there. So the only way to make people make things in the United States is with protectionism. If you say a computer made in America will have no tax on it, but a computer that comes from China will have a 50% tax on it, well, then maybe they'll make more computers in America, but they'll sell for a higher price. So, and the same thing is true whether you're talking about T-shirts or baby shoes or cars. Protectionism will raise the price. He also said he would subsidize business. Well, that's going to cost us money, and that's going to cause the government to run a deficit, and then the Federal Reserve to accommodate the deficit by pumping more money into the economy. So absolutely every point of his inflation plan is going to have a tendency to increase prices and inflation. And I don't know how anybody can be so unremittingly wrong. But if you go through all the rest of his State of the Union, it was just all, the government is going to do this for you, and the government is going to do this to you. And remember, that's usually the flip side of the same thing. If they're going to send you a check, they're going to tax somebody to get that money. So the program was just tax and spend and regulate and mandate and prosecute. So it was very depressing in that sense.
Yeah, I asked a buddy of mine who's knee deep in politics. He always was. And I said, hey, you're going to watch the, and he's a really smart guy. He's not, and I said to him, yo, you're going to watch the State of the Union. And he goes, nah, it's Joe Biden. So,
Well, that's true. I've been watching Joe Biden and unimpressed for 30 years. Maybe it's more like 45 years. And my God, he ended up president. How did that happen? But hey, we've had a lot of people be president that we said, how the hell did that happen?
I'm sure there was Ronald Reagan, man, and then Bush too. I mean, Bush the younger, because I mean, was a little bit like that. But that must be interesting, just like watching a guy that you've known for 45 years and he becomes president. You're like, oh wow. I never really would have thought of it like that, because I'm a little bit younger there. So talking about a little bit foreign policy with the current situation in Russia and Ukraine. I mean, do we just let it handle itself out, them deal with their own problems, or how would a libertarian federal government handle this situation?
Well, there are a lot of things going on that aren't just letting it play out. We have rallied most of the Western world and even most of the world to do things like freezing Russian assets, barring Russian airplanes from European airspace, sending arms. I'm not necessarily endorsing every one of those things, but it's not that the democracies are doing nothing. If the alternative, though, is that we should go to war with Russia, I think that's a bad idea. I think the United States has had enough with overseas wars that were not essential to our vital interests. And I think at this point, nobody in the United States wants to go to war with Russia. And one of the things you hear people saying is, well, let's create a no-fly zone, prevent Russian planes from flying over Ukraine. That sounds cool. But what it means is you are proposing that we send American and British fighter jets to shoot down Russian airplanes. And that's war with a nuclear armed power. And I don't think that's a good idea. So if we can use our good offices to find a diplomatic solution, which obviously failed before the war started, but could still happen, then that we should do. The other thing I would have recommended, and this doesn't excuse Putin being a bloody imperialist, but a lot of people, including a lot of libertarians, said from 1991 on, let's manage the demise of this Soviet empire carefully. Let's not dance a jig on their grave. Let's not mock and ridicule them. And let's not move NATO troops closer and closer to Russia. But our government and European governments didn't follow that. And so we put a lot of European countries that were bordering Russia into NATO. Now, we know we are entirely a peace-loving country, and we have no intention of using our NATO connections to invade Russia. But from Russia's point of view, they saw NATO expanding right up to their borders, right up into what used to be the Soviet Empire, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and they kind of felt surrounded. Now, that's not a justification for invading Ukraine, and neither is the idea that, oh, really, Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. They're close, I guess. Americans and Canadians are close, but we don't invade Canada and say, you should be part of us, so we come and invade you. So we must condemn this invasion, and we've really rallied more of the world than you've ever seen. I mean, you got Goldman Sachs and Switzerland and the Soccer Federation all participating in this freeze and isolate Russia thing. But I think we don't want troops there. We don't want to be bogged down in another endless war.
I agree. I was on Instagram, as I usually am. I just use it to promote comedy stuff I do, and the podcast. But I was just thinking of, imagine World War II, Hitler invading certain countries and somebody with a phone like filming bombings, filming people gunning people down the street, and people like raising like, I stand with Ukraine, I stand with even back then in World War II with Poland. I just thought that changes the game because everyone in the world sees it now and everybody voices an opinion and everyone's going like, F you, Putin and everything like that. That's totally, there's not really a question there, but just a statement about how crazy that is. Imagine putting that into context. You can't really invade a country anymore because people will just take the side of the country.
Well, you can invade a country, but you can't do it secretly anymore, or even with, the news getting to America 2 days later and it's just text. You're right. We now have average people filming Russian bombs, Russian troops invading a city that we didn't have before. Mm-hmm. So there is a great deal more transparency in the whole world these days, sometimes for good and ill. I mean, mm-hmm. things happen that probably should have been kept private and are not, but it does also mean it's harder for governments to get away with their oppressive acts.
And probably for the better. That I wanted to ask one more question because I thought what you just said was a good way to end it out on. China and Taiwan, do you think they're going to do that as well, like follow suit?
Well, a lot of people made bad predictions about Russia and Ukraine, so I want to be careful about that. And I'm not a China expert. I will say, I believe China genuinely believes that Taiwan is part of China. Mm-hmm. And they think it's like if Florida seceded, wouldn't the United States demand that they stay in the Union? On the other hand, Taiwan has had, 70, 80 years, 70, I guess, of independence, and they have built a strong, prosperous, democratic country. And although they're much smaller than China, they, I think, are very determined to remain independent. And so it won't be an easy thing to conquer. There would be a war. There would be Chinese soldiers dying. And remember, Taiwan is an island, which makes it somewhat more difficult. You can't just roll tanks across the border. You got to put them on ships, and you can still bomb. But China has actually, for all the horrors that China performs at home, China has not invaded another country in a long time. And I would say that their people are happy getting richer than they were under Maoist rules, under communism. And they won't, and remember, China had this one-child policy. So all the people with 20-year-old sons, that's their only child. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that we're going to pack a bunch of them onto ships and send them to fight in the hills of Taiwan, I suspect there will be a lot of Chinese people who do not like that idea and won't like the results. And the Chinese government knows that. So I have no doubt that Xi would like to go to his ancestors having united China. But there's a reason he hasn't done it yet.
Do you know? Oh, that's the reason I was going to ask
you. The reason is it's not as easy as some people think. And I doubt that it's getting any easier because Taiwan is getting richer every year.
Mm. And real quick, too, I saw a report about Canada and how the prime minister there was using emergency powers there. And I think seizing some bank accounts. Was there any concern there why that's been under the radar?
Oh, absolutely. This whole thing about emergency powers, the United States itself is currently under numerous emergency declarations, some of which were passed 40 years ago and just never got rescinded. We really need to come up with a way to rein in these emergency powers. We have governors who seized emergency powers in regard to the pandemic. We have presidents that seize emergency powers. President Trump announced an emergency at the border that allowed him to take money that Congress had appropriated for one thing and use it to spend on his wall because Congress wouldn't appropriate money for the wall. That's like the worst kind of emergency order. Congress has the power of the purse. If they refuse to pass your spending plan, then you can't spend the money. But Trump declared an emergency and Congress didn't overrule it. And then you have Justin Trudeau, who famously declared an emergency in order to clear these trucks out of Ottawa and off the bridge. I think it was unnecessary. Look, any government is going to insist that protesters stop blocking bridges and stop blocking Parliament, but he didn't need the emergency powers to do that. To his credit, A few days after they ended that problem, he did rescind the emergency order. But there was a lot of pressure to do that. I'm glad he did. But yes, whenever you hear a politician say emergency, grab your wallet, lock yourself in your house. He's likely to do something that isn't really part of our constitutional Republican form of government, which Canada also has a different constitution, but they also are a constitutional republic where there's an emergency law, but you're not supposed to use it except in a real emergency.
You know, I will say, I think with the government lockdowns and COVID in the past 2 years, I think people are really waking up to the power that mayors and governors have. I don't really think there's a lot of people, unless you're really knee deep in like state and local politics, you really think about that. Now people are aware, you know. So now,
I think that's right, and certainly the federal government gets a lot more news attention. People don't pay that much attention to the actual things that state and city governments are doing. In this case, you know, I do think a pandemic was a real emergency, but that still doesn't mean you get to do any old thing you want to. And in particular, a pandemic that lasts for a year or 2 years, the governor has plenty of time at least to go to the legislature and say, these are the policies I think we need to implement, and I want you to pass them. And if the people's representatives won't pass those laws, then the governor shouldn't be able to do it. Emergency power is like, if you see Russian ships off the U.S. coast, then the president probably needs to take some emergency actions. But if the president says, I think we should go in and overthrow the government of Iraq, then you go ask Congress at least whether they will authorize that. Congress has the power to declare war. And similarly, legislatures should make decisions about lockdowns and things like that. And we might still not like the legislature's decision, but at least there would be some semblance of Republican governance.
I think so. I agree with that. Well, you answered all the questions I want to go through. I know I promised I'd keep you only for an hour, but so I hope and aren't too long. But I guess let me just wrap up with this, because I feel like I need to touch base on it at one point, and it's respecting your privacy, obviously, but with the vaccinations, I think I remember seeing an article with you saying like have a healthy skepticism of government, but you were vaccinated. Can you speak to how you reconciled that decision making?
Well, I don't see anything to reconcile there. The government says, people should eat more produce and less sugar. But you should still eat more produce and less sugar. It would be good for you. So the fact that the government says it doesn't mean I shouldn't do it. So I can be against a government mandate about vaccination and still think I should be vaccinated, and I am. And I'm vaccinated for all sorts of things, shingles and diphtheria and pertussis, whatever that is. Fortunately, a lot of these vaccinations have eliminated so many diseases, we don't even have to know what they are. Who's heard of anybody getting pertussis or diphtheria? But we still do the vaccinations. So whether there should be vaccine mandates in an emergency like the Spanish flu or coronavirus is a question for political theory, public policy. Whether you should get vaccinated is a question that, you should listen to your doctor. You should see what scientific experts say. You can certainly weigh how old you are and how vulnerable you are, all of those things. But whether or not the government is mandating it is not important to me in the question of whether I think it's a good thing for me. The government bans heroin. I never had any interest in using heroin. I don't think they should ban it for adults, but the fact that they banned it doesn't make me want to go out and use heroin.
Got you. On that note, I'll wrap up there. Mr. Boaz, thank you for your time. Like I said, I said I'd keep you for an hour, and I want to hold myself to that. But this is great. Is there anything you want to plug social media wise, or anything, learn more about libertarianism or anything like that?
Well, sure. You should buy my book, The Libertarian Mind. And if you're up for more reading, you should buy The Libertarian Reader. And you can follow me on Twitter if you want to. You can even follow me on Facebook because my page is open. And you should go to libertarianism.org for a lot of resources on libertarianism.
All right. Well, again, I say thank you. This was an honor, sir.
Thank you.
10 years in the making. Ever since I saw you on that escalator at that hotel, I was like,
great. Thanks.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. And see you next week. Goodbye. Take it.